The first day. Here begins the first day of the Decameron, wherein, after the author has showed the reasons why certain persons gathered to tell tales, they treat of any subject pleasing to them under the rule of Pampania. Most gracious ladies, knowing that you are all by nature pitiful, I know that in your judgment this work will seem to have a painful or sad origin, for it brings to mind the unhappy recollection of that late dreadful plague, so pernicious to all who saw or heard of it. But I would not have this frighten you from reading further, as though you were to pass through nothing but sighs and tears in your reading. This dreary opening will be like climbing a steep mountainside to a most beautiful and delightful valley, which appears the more pleasant in proportion to the difficulty of the ascent. The end of happiness is pain, and in like manner misery ends in unexpected happiness. This brief fatigue, I say brief because it occupies only a few words, is quickly followed by pleasantness and delight, as I promised you above, which, if I had not promised, you would not expect, perhaps, from this opening. Indeed, if I could have taken you by any other way than this, which I know to be rough, I would gladly have done so, but since I cannot otherwise tell you how the tales you are about to read came to be told, I am forced by necessity to write in this manner. In the year 1348, after the fruitful incarnation of the Son of God, that most beautiful of Italian cities, noble Florence, was attacked by deadly plague. It started in the east, either through the influence of the heavenly bodies or because God's just anger with our wicked deeds sent it as a punishment to mortal men, and in a few years killed an innumerable quantity of people. Ceaselessly passing from place to place, it extended its miserable length over the west. Against this plague, all human wisdom and foresight were vain. Orders had been given to cleanse the city of filth. The entry of any sick person was forbidden. Much advice was given for keeping healthy. At the same time, humble supplications were made to God by pious persons in processions and otherwise. And yet, in the beginning of the spring of the year mentioned, its horrible results began to appear, and in a miraculous manner. The symptoms were not the same as in the East, where a gush of blood from the nose was the plain sign of inevitable death. But it began both in men and women with certain swellings of the groin or under the armpit. They grew to the size of a small apple or an egg, more or less, and were vulgarly called tumors. In a short space of time, these tumors spread from the two parts named all over the body. Soon after this, the symptoms changed, and black or purple spots appeared on the arms and thighs or any other part of the body, sometimes a few large ones, sometimes many little ones. These spots were a certain sign of death, just as the original tumor had been and still remained. No doctor's advice, no medicine could overcome or alleviate this disease. An enormous number of ignorant men and women set up as doctors in addition to those who were trained. Either the disease was such that no treatment was possible, or the doctors were so ignorant that they did not know what caused it and consequently could not administer the proper remedy. In any case, very few recovered. Most people died within about 3 days of the appearance of the tumors described above, most of them without any fever or other symptoms. The violence of this disease was such that the sick communicated it to the healthy when who came near them, just as a fire catches anything dry or oily near it. And it even went further. To speak to or go near the sick brought infection and a common death to the living, and moreover, to touch the clothes of anything else the sick had touched or worn gave the disease to the person touching. What I am about to tell you now is a marvelous thing to hear, and if I and others had not seen it with our own eyes, I would not dare to write it, however much I was willing to believe, or whatever the good faith of the person from whom I had heard it. So violent was the malignancy of this plague that it was communicated not only from one man to another, but from the garments of a sick or dead man to animals of another species, which caught the disease in that way and very quickly died of it. One day, among other occasions, I saw with my own eyes, as I just said now, the rags left lying in the street of a poor man who had died of the plague. Two pigs came along, and as their habit is, turned the clothes over with their snouts and munched at them, with the result that they were both fell dead almost at once on the rags, as if they had been poisoned. From these and similar or greater occurrences, such fear and fanciful notions took possession of the living that almost all of them adopted the same cruel policy, which was entirely to avoid the sick and everything belonging to them. By doing so, each one thought he would secure his own safety. Some thought that moderate living and the avoidance of all superfluity would preserve them from the epidemic. They formed small communities living entirely separate from everybody else. They shut themselves up in houses when there were no sick, eating the finest food and drinking the best wine very temperately, avoiding all excess, allowing no news or discussion of death and sickness, and passing the time in music and such like pleasures. Others thought just the opposite. They thought the sure cure for the plague was to drink and be merry, to go about singing and amusing themselves, satisfying every appetite they could, laughing and jesting at what happened. They put their words into practice, spent day and night going from tavern to tavern, drinking immoderately, or went into other people's houses, doing only those things which pleased them. This they could do easily, because everyone felt doomed and had abandoned his property, so that most houses became common property of any stranger who went in and made use of them as if he had owned them. And with all this bestial behavior, they avoided the sick as much as possible. In this suffering and misery of our city, the authority of human and divine laws almost disappeared, for, like other men, the ministers and executors of the law were all dead or sick or shut up with their families, so that no duties could be carried out. Every man was therefore able to do as he pleased. Many others adopted a course of life midway between the two just described. They did not restrict their victuals so much as the former, nor allow themselves to be drunken and dissolute like the latter, but satisfied their appetites moderately. They did not shut themselves up, but went about carrying flowers or scented herbs or perfumes in their hands, in the belief that it was an excellent thing to comfort the brain with such odors. For the whole air was infected with the smell of dead bodies, of sick persons, and medicines. Others again held a still more cruel opinion, which they thought would keep them safe. They said that the only medicine against the plague-stricken was to go right away from them. Men and women, convinced of this and caring about nothing but themselves, abandoned their own property, their own houses, their dwellings, their relatives, their property, uh, and went abroad, or at least to the country round Florence, as if God's wrath in punishing men's wickedness with this plague would not follow them, but strike only those who remained within the walls of the city, or as if they thought nobody else in the city would remain alive and that its last hour had come. Not everyone who adopted any of these various opinions died, nor did all escape. Some, when they were still healthy, had set the example of avoiding the sick, and, falling ill themselves, died untended. One citizen avoided another. Hardly any neighbor troubled about others. Relatives never or hardly ever visited each other. Moreover, such terror was struck into the hearts of men and women by this calamity that brother abandoned brother, and uncle his nephew, and sister her brother, and very often the wife her husband. What is even worse and nearly incredible is that fathers and mothers refused to see and tend their children as if they had not been theirs. Thus, a multitude of sick men and women were left without any care except for the charity of friends, but these were few, or the greed of servants, though not many of these could be had even for high wages. Moreover, most of them were coarse-minded men and women who did little more than bring the sick what they asked for, or watch over them when they were dying, and very often their servants lost their wives and their earnings. lost their lives and their earnings. Since the sick were thus abandoned by neighbors, relatives, and friends, while servants were scarce, a habit sprang up which had never been heard of before. Beautiful and noble women, when they fell sick, did not scruple to take a young or old manservant, whoever he might be, and with no sort of shame expose every part of their bodies to these men as if they had been women, for they were compelled by the necessity of their sickness to do so. This, perhaps, was a cause of looser morals in those women who survived. In this way, many people died who might have been saved if they had been looked after. Owing to the lack of attendance for the sick and the violence of the plague, such a multitude of people in the city died day and night that it was stupefying to hear of, let alone to see. From sheer necessity, then, several ancient customs were quite altered among the survivors. The custom had been, as we still see it today, that women, relatives, and neighbors should gather at the house of the deceased and there lament with the family. About the same time, men would gather at the door of the male neighbors and other citizens. Then came the clergy, few or many according to the person's rank. The coffin was placed on the shoulders of his friends and carried with funeral pomp on lighted candles, and dirges to the church would be which the deceased had chosen before dying. But as the fury of the plague increased, this custom wholly or nearly disappeared, and new customs arose. Thus, people died not only without having a number of women near them, but without a single witness. Very few indeed were honored with the piteous laments and bitter tears of their relatives, who, on the contrary, spent their time in mirth, feasting, and jesting. Even the women abandoned womanly pity and adopted this custom for their own safety. Few were they whose bodies were accompanied to church by more than 10 or a dozen neighbors. Nor were these grave and honorable citizens but grave diggers. From the lowest of the people, who got themselves called sextons and performed the task for money, they took up the bier and hurried it off, not to the church chosen by the deceased, but to the church nearest, preceded by 4 or 6 of the clergy, with few candles and often none at all. With the aid of the grave diggers, the clergy huddled the bodies away in any grave they could find, without giving themselves the trouble of a long or solemn burial service. The plight of the lower and most of the middle classes was even more pitiful to behold. Most of them remained in their houses, either through poverty or in the hopes of safety, and fell sick by thousands. Since they received no care or attention, almost all of them died. Many ended their lives in the streets, both at night and during the day, and many others who died in their houses were only known to be dead because the neighbors smelled their decaying bodies. Dead bodies filled every corner. Most of them were treated in the same manner by the survivors, who were more concerned to get rid of their rotting bodies than moved by charity towards the dead. With the aid of porters, if they could get them, they carried the bodies out of the houses and laid them at the doors, where every morning quantities of the dead might be seen. Then they were laid on biers, or, as they were often lacking, on tables. Often a single bier carried 2 or 3 bodies, and it happened frequently that a husband and wife, 2 or 3 brothers, or father and son were taken off on the same bier. It frequently happened that 2 priests, each carrying a cross, would go out, followed by 3 or 4 biers carried by porters, and where the priests thought there was 1 person to bury, there would be 6 or 8, and often even more. Nor were these dead honored by tears and lighted candles and mourners, for things had reached such a pass that people cared no more for dead men than we care for dead goats. Thus it plainly appeared that what the wise had not learned to endure with patience through the few calamities of ordinary life became a matter of indifference even to the most ignorant people through the greatness of this misfortune. Such was the multitude of corpses brought to the churches every day and almost every hour, that there was not enough consecrated ground to give them burial, especially since they wanted to bury each person in the family grave, according to the old custom. Although the cemeteries were full, they were forced to dig huge trenches where they buried the bodies by hundreds. Here they stowed them away like bales in the hold of a ship and covered them with a little earth until the whole trench was full. Not to pry any further into all the details of the miseries which afflicted our city, I shall add that the surrounding country was spared nothing of what befell Florence. The villages, on a smaller scale, were like the city. In the fields and isolated farms, the poor wretched peasants and their families were without doctors or any assistance, and perished in the highways, in their fields and houses, night and day, more like beasts than men. Just as the townsmen became dissolute and indifferent to their work and property, so the peasants, when they saw that death was upon them, entirely neglected the future fruits of their past labors, both from the earth and from cattle, and thought only of enjoying what they had. Thus it happened that cows, asses, sheep, goats, pigs, fowls, and even dogs, those faithful companions of man, left the farms and wandered at their will through the fields, where the wheat crops stood abandoned, unreaped, and ungarnered. Many of these animals still endowed with reason, for after they had pastured all day, they returned to the farms for the night of their own free will, without being driven. Returning from the country to the city, and it may be said that such was the cruelty of heaven, and perhaps in the part of men, that between March and July more than 100,000 persons died within the walls of Florence, and between the violence of the plague and the abandonment in which the sick were left by the cowardice of the healthy, and before the plague, it was not thought that the whole city held so many people. Oh, what great palaces! How many fair houses and noble dwellings, once filled with attendants and noble ladies, were emptied to the meanest servant! How many famous names and their possessions and renowned estates were left without an heir! How many gallant men and fair ladies and handsome youths, whom Galen, Hippocrates, and Esculapius themselves would have said were in perfect health, at noon dined with their relatives and friends, and at night supped with their ancestors in the next world.